Like most geckos, a nocturnal species. They're found active at night, and what they're doing basically is cruising around on rock escarpments, or in the case of this species and a few others, they're moving around on red sand dunes, and they're basically cruising around and looking for something to eat. They have quite a voracious appetite, and at this size, certainly capable of taking something, even the size of a large moth or a large locust or something like that. In fact, their stomach is often bigger than their own. They're basically bigger than what they can take sometimes, and they'll sometimes take huge food items, and their huge wide mouth enables them to do that. Now, the knob-tailed geckos, and in fact most of our Australian gecko species, are what we call endemic, or only found here in Australia. They're very unique, and what we might get a look at here, if we look closely, you may have noticed just a second ago he was poking out his tongue. Now, they don't do this because they want to stick their tongue out. What they do, they'll actually clean their eye with their own tongue. They don't have an eyelid like we do. They can't blink. So often they'll get lots of sand and debris on the surface of the eye, which doesn't bother them too much, but they can clean the eye as they need to using that big wide tongue, and they can basically reach it outside the side of the mouth and lick their own eye. Pretty amazing. Now, we're going to leave our knob-tailed gecko there. I do love knob-tailed geckos. I've actually been fortunate enough to see all 10 species in the wild in Australia. So I've travelled extensively and I've seen all 10 species of knob-tailed gecko. Now we're going to look at one of our agamid or dragon lizards. This one here is known as the central netted dragon, one of our more common small dragon species found throughout the arid interior of Australia. You don't find this species here on the coast, but you do start to see them once you head out into Western New South Wales, and certainly right throughout WA, South Australia and the Northern Territory. This is a species that can deal with very, very warm temperatures. I've actually found these lizards out in Western Queensland in the middle of summer, and they've been basking on a hot bitumen road in the middle of the day, and I've actually taken a temperature gun, and pointed it at the road where the lizard was basking, and sometimes they're over 70 degrees, these places that they're choosing to bask. So they can deal with extremely warm temperatures, quite a bit warmer than most of our other Australian reptiles. They're quite unique in that fact, and they're really well adapted for living in that hot, arid environment. What they'll do if they do want to get out of the heat is they actually head underground. They'll dig burrow systems, they go under rocks, and during the cooler months, certainly that's where they'll spend most of their time. And then during summer, of course, they are spending most of their time, particularly in the morning and late afternoon, basking in that sun, getting as warm as they possibly can, and cruising around and feeding on, again, insects. Most of our smaller Australian lizards like this are going to be feeding on invertebrates or insects. Now again, another very cute little lizard here. This one's not quite fully grown. They will get a little larger than this, and the males in this species typically get far larger than the females, and they have a much wider, stockier head. We're competing with the dingoes a bit in the back there, but that's all right. They want to get in and tell you a little bit about lizards as well. All right, well, there's our central netted dragon. Pop them back in there. And now we're going to look at potentially one of Australia's most iconic lizard species, and that is this one here, the shingleback skink. Now, just like our central netted dragon, this species is found across a very wide region of the country. They're a member of the blue-tongued skink family, so they're in the same genus as all of the blue-tongued species, which is known as Taliqua, and you would have noticed that blue tongue when he sticks it out every now and again. Now, basically what they're using that tongue for is defense. What this lizard will do in the wild, if he was faced by a predator, he's going to spin around, open up that mouth as wide as he can. Now, you get that flush of blue immediately from that broad, thick tongue. And that, typically in nature, those bright colours, they typically mean dangerous or poisonous or venomous. If we think of something like a coral snake, a red-bellied black snake, a dart frog, poison dart frog, they're all brightly coloured to basically provide a bit of a warning, to allow predators the opportunity to leave them alone and hopefully head in the opposite direction. Now, of course, our shingleback lizard isn't actually dangerous whatsoever. He'd give you a nasty bite, but that's about it. But he wants that predator to think he's extremely dangerous, and hopefully he gets to go off and live the rest of his life unharmed. Now, he's got another little trick to avoid predators up his sleeve, and that is this tail. What he'll do if he is faced by a predator, say a dingo, like we're hearing in the background, he'll basically turn himself into a horseshoe shape like this, and then, as you can see, they have this quite unusual fat tail, which looks very much like the head. And it gets very, very confusing for the predator. And sometimes they might accidentally, instead of biting the head, bite the tail. And that's what that lizard wants. This is a fat reserve. He can lose a portion of this tail quite easily and still continue to go about his life. But if he loses the head, of course, he's not going to be able to do that. So that's a little predator deterrence thing that he can do. And hopefully he's going to live for a very long time. They can live for a fairly long time, and one of the unique things about shingleback skinks is that they are what we call monogamous, which means they partner up for life. They're very romantic. So the males, when they reach sexual maturity, they're going to find a female shingleback. They'll follow her around during the breeding season. They mate with her, and then once that breeding season has finished, they go off and they head in their opposite directions, and then the following breeding season, those two exact lizards will find each other again, and then they mate together again, and they live their lives together. Quite cute. Now we're going to pop our shingleback lizard in here, or shingleback skink, one of our largest skinks that we have here in Australia. And then we're going to look at another very iconic lizard species. This one here, I'm sure many of you would have seen if you visited the reptile park. All you have to do is head to the entrance of the park, and you would have seen a very large model replica frilled neck dragon. And that's what we have here. This is a young male. He's quite a bit adventurous here. He's probably going to sit up on my shoulder, which is all right. He can do that. And this species is found in the northern tropical regions of the country. Now they get that name frilled dragon because they have these, oh, where are you going? They have these flaps of skin behind the head, which they can actually expand. I'll see if he wants to allow us to kind of do it there. And what he's doing is making himself look larger and more threatening than he actually is. He makes himself really large, he puffs the throat out, opens the mouth, puffs that frill out, and hopefully, just like the shingleback, that will deter the predator, and that frilly can, again, go about the rest of his day, and he remains unharmed. Now this is again a dragon lizard, same family as our central netted dragon that we saw before, but unlike the central netted dragon, which is spending a lot of time down on the ground, moving around, living in burrows, the frilled neck dragon is almost strictly arboreal. So they're spending their time up in the trees, they're up there basking, they have a really good vantage point from high in a tree, they can scan the surrounding area and search for insects. When they see one, they'll run down, they'll grab it, and then they pretty well head straight back up again. So they're almost strictly arboreal in that respect. Again, one of our most iconic, famous Australian lizards, and again, you find these in the northern parts of the country. In fact, Darwin, even within the city itself, is one of the best places in Australia to see frilled dragons. One of our favourites here. They're very unique and very iconic.
We might grab the shingleback out just so we can answer a few questions about the physicalities of lizards. So one of the questions coming through is, do lizards have ears?
They do. I'll grab our shingleback here. It might be a little bit hard to see, but if you look behind there, there is a tiny little slot, and that is this lizard's ear. Now, they're very different to snakes in that respect. Snakes do not have ears, and that is one of the very easy ways to tell the difference between a legless lizard, which we have many of here in Australia, and a snake. So whilst they are lizards and they have no legs and look very similar to a snake, they will always have that external ear opening, and it's a very easy way to tell the difference between the two. If you look at our, not an Australian lizard, but our Komodo dragons, they have a huge ear just on the side of their head. It almost looks like a hole in the side of their head, and that is their ear. But on these smaller species, it can be quite hard to see, particularly on this shingleback right now, because it's tucked right away behind the head here. They have quite a triangular shaped head, and the ears slip right back in there.
So are lizards like snakes in the way, do they smell with their tongue, or do they use their nostrils to smell?
So they certainly do have nostrils, you'll see right there on the end of the snout. But same deal as a snake, not quite as sensitive as a snake, but they do possess what we call a Jacobson's organ, which is in the roof of the mouth, which does enable them to pick up on scent particles and basically relays a message to the brain and allows them to get a bit of an idea as to what's going on around them using that tongue. Now, the monitor lizards in particular are very similar to snakes. They've got a highly evolved sensory system in the tongue, and that is quite a sensitive system, and they're far more advanced than some of the other lizard species.
Do all lizards have the same kind of diet, or does it change between lizards?
No, it varies quite a bit. Some lizards are what we call omnivorous, which means they're feeding on invertebrates, but they're also feeding on vegetation. And a central-netted dragon is certainly an example of that. He would be feeding out in the wild on some weeds, some grasses, some flowers, but then again, he's also going to feed on insect prey. This shingleback skink here is very similar, whereas your monitor lizards and most of your geckos, they're feeding pretty well strictly on meat. They're feeding on invertebrates and small mammals and things like that.
Can lizards be venomous?
They can. Not here in Australia, but overseas, over in the United States and Mexico, there is 2 species of true venomous lizard, which are known as the bearded lizard and the Gila monster. We have Gila monsters here at the reptile park, but in saying that, and it can get a bit controversial sometimes, the monitor lizards, which we have many of here in Australia, about 30 species, they do possess quite a rudimentary venom, which can sometimes cause a little bit of pain and localized swelling, even in some of our smaller Australian species. So 2 true venomous lizard species, but the monitor lizards could potentially be classified as venomous. It depends on the way you look at it.
Talking about monitor lizards, there's been a lot of footage in the media of people being chased by monitor and goanna lizards in campgrounds. What's your advice to people in those situations?
The most important thing you can do if you do see a monitor lizard out in the wild, even within a campground in a national park, is keep a clear distance from it. You don't want to go too close to it, because sometimes, particularly with the big males, they can get very confident, and over time they can start to see humans as a source of food. Say people over the years have been feeding a big male lace monitor sausages every now and again, he's going to associate people with food. And sometimes in that circumstance they can get a little bit adventurous. They might approach you, they may even come up right to your feet, they'll tongue flick you, potentially even in some cases climb up the person. Now that's a very rare thing to happen. It doesn't happen very regularly at all, but with those big male monitor lizards, they do get big, they do get confident, and yeah, there is a chance that something like that could happen, but the best thing to do to avoid that is to never ever feed any wild animal, particularly monitor lizards, which can get very voracious when it comes to food.
Do we have lots of lizard species in Australia?
We do, yeah. When it comes to skinks like this, we have over 400 species of skink. Many of those are very, very small, and then we've got some slightly larger ones like this one here. Monitor lizards, as I mentioned, we have more species of monitor lizard than anywhere else in the world, about 30 species. Geckos, same deal, over 150 species of geckos. So we're incredibly lucky. Our lizards are very diverse, and they're found across a wide array of habitats. You'd be very hard pressed to visit anywhere in Australia that does not have a local lizard species.
Do lizards lay eggs or give birth to live young?
A bit of both. It depends on the species. Shingleback skink like this is going to be giving birth to live young, and their live young are extremely large. A female shingleback, when she gives birth, could give birth to a baby potentially 30% of her own body weight, so it's an extremely large baby. But then you have other species that will lay eggs, and it gets a bit confusing. It's not strictly dependent on the family either. So in the skinks like this, you have some that give birth to live young, and then some that will lay eggs. All the monitor lizards will be laying eggs. Your geckos, they'll be laying eggs. So it just depends on the group and the species themselves.
So they're quite varied between all of the different species in pretty much all of their features.
All respects, yeah. Colour, size, as I mentioned, some are laying eggs, some aren't, and some of them can deal with extremely cold climates. We think of typically Tasmania as being more or less a reptile-free zone, but it's certainly not when it comes to lizards. There's only 3 species of snake down there. There's quite a number of particularly skink species that call Tasmania home, and there is even a tiny skink that lives on a very hostile island off the coast of Tasmania, so they can deal with some extremely harsh conditions as well. Shinglebacks like this are a perfect example of that. You find these skinks out walking about in some very barren parts of the country in temperatures that sometimes exceed 40 degrees. So yeah, it just depends on the species.
And we'll finish up with one last question. What's your favourite species of lizard?
My favourite species of lizard here in Australia would have to be one of our small monitor species known as the Kimberley rock monitor. They're found up in the Kimberley region in WA. They're a beautiful lizard. They have a huge long tail on them, very attractive lizard, and they're very quick as well. I've only seen glimpses of them in the wild, unfortunately. But as a whole, geckos, they're another one of my favourites, and I've been fortunate to see a lot of Australian geckos in the wild. I love getting out and finding lizards. Alright guys, we're going to leave it there. I hope you've learnt a little bit about just a few of our Australian lizard species. Hit the books, get on the internet and look at a few of our others because they are incredible. They're very variable, and we love them here at the park. I hope you enjoyed that, guys. We're going to have plenty more videos coming to you throughout the day. If you love the dingoes in the background, we're going to do a whole video on dingoes this week as well. So stay tuned and we will see you next time. Thank you.